everybody, I'm Joe. We're talking about Marvel Multiverse. We're going to talk about ability point buy today. We're going to talk about negative ability point buy and min-maxing. There's a lot to talk about, so let's get started. I've built a lot of characters and heroes and villains potentially on this channel, and I'm proud of those builds. I like doing it. I think it's a fun way of exploring the system, and I'm proud of the work that I've done, and hopefully I've been able to help you, or perhaps even your narrator, with coming up with characters, NPCs, or villains that are interesting at the table. But you've probably noticed that I tend to do negative point buy when I make a character. And this has sparked some discussion about, is that the best way to build a character? Is it appropriate? Is it the most fun? Is it not as much fun for the rest of the table? Do I rely on it too much as somebody who builds characters and shares them? And I think these are all very valid questions. And so I want to talk about that today. We're going to talk about the ability point buy rules, make sure we all understand them. So if you're new to building characters, I'm going to make sure this makes sense. We're going to talk about how this leads to potentially two different styles of building characters. What is perhaps called the well-rounded character, which does not do ability point buy into the negative and just is additive to ability points. And then, well, the opposite of well-rounded, I suppose, would be a sharp character, a character that does one thing really well at the detriment to other things. This is oftentimes referred to as min-maxing, though I don't love that phrase because it tends to have a negative connotation to some folks. So we're going to talk about these two ways of building characters and the pros and cons of each one, and why I build characters on this channel the way that I oftentimes do, and how I might, in the future, alter the way that I discuss building a character so that I can make it beneficial for folks who are wanting to do negative point buy and those who don't. So that's kind of where we're headed. The rules for ability point buy are pretty straightforward. When you build a character, you get 5 ability points per each rank. So we're starting at rank 1, we get 5 ability points. Okay? If you choose to not take a power at a rank, you can add an additional ability point as well. If you want to, when you build a character, you can decide to take an attribute and take a negative modifier in it, and then use those points somewhere else. And this is a way of making other things higher than they would be at the detriment of some others. Now, this is going to affect checks, attack rolls, and defense scores. What is called an action check in this game can be something you're attempting to do, and that thing can include an attack. If I'm doing an action check, I roll the appropriate skill, and then I add my modifier. If the modifier is negative, then I have to subtract that value. So when you have an ability point, that is going to make it more likely that you succeed at any single thing that you want to do. If you're doing an attack roll, after doing the damage multiplier, you then add your ability score on top, and that helps bump the damage. We're going to get to this, but that is really not a critical thing, realistically. Your defense score for any of your 6 attributes is going to be 10 plus your ability points, right? And so if you have a positive modifier, let's say you're building a character at rank 1, you put 1 point into melee, you now have a melee defense of 11. But if you took a negative modifier, perhaps a -1, then you would have a defense score of 9. It's important to point out that some things attack a defense score. So if I was to make a close attack, that is generally speaking against the melee defense, if that character has the evasion power, then the agility defense gets to be used in place of the melee defense for the purposes of not being hit by the attack. However, some powers specifically reference, but do not specifically attack a defense score. In those instances, that bypasses the brawling, evasion, wisdom, and integrity powers, what I refer to as the SAD powers. Those powers allow you to use one defense score for another when that second defense score is attacked, but they can be bypassed. And also, this does not help you if you are doing some kind of a check. So for instance, if you have dumped your ego score and you have the integrity power where you get to use your logic defense against the ego attacks, but then I ask you as the narrator to roll ego to persuade somebody, you still have a negative modifier on that check. Okay, so now we're clear on the way that point buy works and how negative point buy can happen. You cannot do a negative point buy in any stat that is greater than a -4. That is your limit. A -4 is pretty punishing. And so we might think of two ways of building a character. The well-rounded character does not take a negative point buy. They're only additive to their point buy system. And that is a great way of making a character that's good at a lot of checks, reasonably good in all pillars of play, but is not going to, because of how few ability points you get, that character is not going to necessarily be amazing or super consistent at any one individual skill, which might be appropriate. Failure is oftentimes more fun than success in a TTRPG. So let's talk about these two. The well-rounded character is a wonderful way to play, and it's the way that most people build characters initially. It's just by adding points into a lot of different things. A point into melee, 1 point into resilience, a point into vigilance, maybe 2 points into ego, or something like that as they get started. Now, there is a limit to how many points you can have in an ability at any point in the game. And the answer is always 3 plus your rank. So at rank 1, you cannot have any ability that has a higher modifier than a 4, and that will cap out at 9 at rank 6. This character, the well-rounded character, is going to have better average defense scores, generally speaking, but is going to actually have worse defenses. But in exchange, they tend to do way better in checks, and they have more powers to play with. So let's get on what I'm talking about here. If I am slowly adding points into almost everything, well, then I'm going to have okay defenses throughout the entire game. And I may not feel it necessary to take the sad powers. So if I'm an ego-based character, but I still put 1, maybe 2 points into logic by mid-game, I won't feel a need to take wisdom. But if I have a character that has dumped the logic score into negative territory, I might feel a need to take the wisdom power in order to shore up that defense against attacks. But that's a power I have to take. And so I have fewer powers to choose from to do the things I really want to do, because I felt I had to shore up that defense. Additionally, as we said, that negative modifier is still punishing for checks, and it is something that can be bypassed by a lot of powers that don't make direct attacks against the defense score. It's also worth pointing out that if you don't max out an ability score, you actually aren't affecting your damage very much. And I think this is a really important point here. Your damage is not significantly impacted, okay? So let's say we have a melee-based attacker who has Mighty 2. All right, the roll to hit is impacted. Let's say that we roll to hit, you roll 3d6 and you add your melee modifier, your ability score, okay? And that roll to hit, if you have not maxed out melee, is going to be a little bit lower, maybe 1 or 2 points lower than it would have been if you had maxed it out, okay? So your chance to hit is slightly less. However, damage is calculated by taking the Marvel die and multiplying it against your damage multiplier. Your damage multiplier is your rank plus any single way of adding damage. Usually this is the mighty power or the accuracy power, etc. At the end of all of that, you add your ability modifier in as damage, but the multiplied portion is always significantly more impactful to the total damage than your ability modifier at the end. As a result, if you don't max out your actual ability score, your damage is not significantly affected. It's really not. But your chance to hit is. And what's important about the powers that spike damage, mighty, accuracy, brilliance, etc., is that these give a bump either to the damage of an attack roll or to the accuracy of a non-attack roll check, but they do not do both. We discussed this in a video a little while ago called What Actually Is an Attack. We discussed this part of the ruling. So if I have a well-rounded character, I am going to have a better average check across all pillars of play, particularly non-combat pillars of play. I'm also going to be a little bit less likely to hit with an attack, but my damage is not going to be significantly impacted. And if your narrator runs a game that is, like mine, only a third combat, maybe a third combat, a third social encounters, and a third investigation, well, a well-rounded character is going to be more successful at more pillars of play. And that's a really valid way of building a character. Let's talk about sharp characters for a second. Sharp characters are going to have a negative modifier in some pillar of play. And this can be any number of things, but it's usually a mental stat, more often than not. Most damage is based off of melee and agility attacks rather than mental attacks, ego and logic, though those absolutely do exist in the game. But you can dump technically any score if you want to. If I dump a score into negative territory, I am far more pressured, at least internally, to take one of the sad powers. If I dump melee, as I've done with many mental stat-based characters, then I am very likely to take the evasion power in order to have some sort of melee defense. But that cost me a power learned. Also, if I am dumping melee, but I'm a mental stat-based character, I now need to put more points into agility in order to shore up both defenses. But here's where your actual defense against attacks can be better. When I build a character that takes negative modifiers, which is all the time, right? I'm usually going to take 2 of the sad powers, one for physical traits, one for mental traits. And then I put my points into fewer things. So my average defenses actually can be better than a well-rounded character. However, they can be bypassed with certain powers, and my checks are worse. This character is not going to do damage that's significantly higher than a well-rounded character, as discussed, but they are going to hit more often. And so here's really the point of this character. It is in concept. If I have a thing that I want to do, and that thing is more important to me as the player than being successful in all pillars of play, then taking a negative stat is absolutely appropriate. It is something that builds the character that I want. And let's also talk about failure for a second. Here's the thing that the longer you play TTRPGs, the more you realize. Failure's fun. Failure is just funny and it's interesting. It leads to the most exciting moments at the table, the things that you laugh about afterwards, the things you talk with your friends about in years to come. Those are the failures. And so having a character with a negative modifier is just fun. If you have dumped your ego stat and your narrator asks you from time to time to roll ego in order to deceive or persuade somebody, the fact that you know it's going to be abjectly terrible, honestly, can be a lot of fun. And so I'm not afraid of taking negative modifiers because I don't worry about that. Now, does that mean that it's a better style of gameplay? Absolutely not. It's just something I'm not afraid of. But I think that this leads us into thinking about building characters in 2 different sets of priorities. If you prioritize being a part of and reasonably successful in all pillars of gameplay, a well-rounded character is probably the better thing for you. If you have a particular thing you want to do and you want to do it really well, well, then negative modifiers might actually be a great solution for you. And I will tell you, in fairness, when I build a character for me to play, that's the way I like to build them. I like building characters that I play that are going to maximize one particular aspect of the character or set of powers or concept or job inside of combat or something. It's also worth pointing out that when I build a character to share here on this YouTube channel, well, I'm building a concept. I'm building something that explores what a particular power or style of gameplay can accomplish inside of a game system. And if I want to explore that one idea, well, negative modifiers are probably going to be a useful way of accomplishing that goal. Now, importantly, I don't believe this is two different styles of gameplay. I don't. I believe it's two different sets of priorities. We want to build a character that is fun and interesting to us at the table. If the style of character, if you prioritize being well-rounded, then you should not do negative point buy, right? On the other hand, if you prioritize one aspect of gameplay over others, then it might be a valid option. And that's why on this YouTube channel, when I build a character, I almost always do negative point buy. I think that building characters using negative point buy to demonstrate a concept is going to be beneficial. It explores what a concept can do at its absolute limit. But I think that now that I've really taken some time and thought about negative point buy and that some people want to play well-rounded characters, now that I've really considered that, I think that I should be mentioning when I do a character build the way that I would alter the character build if I didn't want to do negative point buy. How would I alter it? Because people aren't going to take a character that I build and plop it verbatim onto a page and bring it to a table. But they might take some of the ideas and incorporate it into a larger concept. And I want to give some guidance for how you might do that. After stewing on this for a couple weeks, I think that I'm going to alter the way that I build characters in the future and give a variety of options. I'll probably still do the build for a negative point buy, but I think it's useful for me to mention how I would build the character if I didn't want to do that. And so for people who've been chatting about this and talking about negative point buy and is min-maxing really the best thing to do, and not everybody wants to do that, I think those are really valid ideas, and I appreciate bringing that into kind of my thought process. All right, that's what I've got for you today. Thanks for watching. YouTube's made out of buttons. I hope you press some of them.